Hello, welcome to PCAP's 8th annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week. This week features a webinar series about ecological goods and services provided by the native prairie ecosystem. My name is Caitlin Monroe-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Oscar Zapata and Dr. Karinna Hidalgo, both from the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan, will be speaking about ecosystem services and biodiversity preservation in the prairie suburban areas. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note we have 2 webinars going on tomorrow. So join us at 12 p.m. for a presentation about pollinators, plants, and people by B City Brandon, followed by Tracking Grassland Change in Canada, USA, and Mexico by the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association at 3 o'clock p.m. And a reminder to our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one, and it makes my job for moderating at the end a little bit easier. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsor, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, as well as our supporting sponsors, North American Helium, Nutrien, and SaskTel. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. So first of all, Dr. Oscar Zapata holds the Centennial Chair in the Community Energy Development and is an assistant professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. His work focuses on understanding the broad socioeconomic elements of sustainability, including the understanding of human behavior and the decision-making process in climate change scenarios. He studies the role of factors that consciously, prices or endowments, or unconsciously, identity, belief, scarcity, adversity, or climate conditions explain people's behavior, thereby determining economic and social outcomes. Oscar holds a PhD and a master's degree in economics from the University of Calgary and a master's in sustainable international development from Bandeas University. And Karinna Hidalgo is an urban planner and designer passionate about the built environment, health, and equity. She is a lecturer and professional associate in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Saskatchewan. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on how natural landscapes and native vegetation in urban areas can improve people's well-being. She has presented her research and teaching outcomes at local, national, and international conferences. Designer and planner by training, Karinna holds a doctoral degree in environmental design and a master's of planning from the University of Calgary. She also has a master's in higher education and educational research, a specialization in urban environmental management, and a bachelor's in design. So with that, I am pleased to pass it over.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you for inviting us. I'm going to start sharing this.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Oops, sorry. There. So yeah, our research, we started this research a year ago, focusing on ecosystem services, trying to find out how we are going to work in what areas of the city. And definitely suburban areas is a place that we really want to focus because of the space and because what we have there. So we are really happy to present our research. We also want to acknowledge that research was funded by the University of Alberta, the Alberta Lands Institute. And yeah, it is an ongoing research, so we keep working on this project.
So today what we're going to do and what we're going to talk about is the main findings of the first stage of this project. And we motivated our project by the following question. How can suburban front yards become ecosystem services producers by transforming the lawns into native pollinator gardens? Understanding that the production of ecosystem services in urban settings in this case is a process that involves both providers of these ecosystems, but also the public in general that can appreciate and value these ecosystem services. So the three main objectives of this project are the following. So the first one is to identify the ecosystem services that suburban areas can produce in prairie cities. And that involved mapping ecosystem services that are potentially produced and the benefits that can be associated with them. The second objective was to determine the challenges that homeowners can face the moment that they decide to shift from traditional lawn practices into native pollinator garden practices. And the last one is to identify the willingness to pay, which is basically a measure of the value of these ecosystem services for city residents. So we will present the main findings of this research today.
So one of the things or the motivations is that we know based on this that the production of ecosystem services is essential for the Canadian Prairie cities to adapt to climate change. So just like a brief summary, so what are the ecosystem services? We know that there are provisioning. So this is taken from the framework for the Millennium Assessment. So we have the provisioning services that are basically the products that we humans obtain from the ecosystems, like food, fresh water, raw materials, medicine, genetic resources. Also, we have the regulating ecosystem services that are services that nature provides to regulate the environment. For example, we have air quality, we have climate regulation, water purification, disease and pest control. And one of the important ones for our research as well is pollination. We have cultural. So there are these intangible, the non-material benefits from nature that are related to recreation, to the aesthetic values, to religious and spiritual values as well, mental and physical health. There's a really great amount of evidence right now showing all the benefits for having biodiversity around for health. Also, there are education, the cultural heritage, and sense of place. And finally, we have the supporting, which are really important because these are the services necessary for the production of more ecosystem services, like soil formation, nutrient cycling, primary production. So it's really interesting to see that all these ecosystem services really can be looked from different fields, from different disciplines. But at the end, the important thing is how we can produce more of them, and especially how we can connect so we really can have an ecosystem around. And one of the things that also it is important is we know that there are all these benefits. So if we combine that with individual and community well-being, we know that that can be done by practices that reduce, for example, water consumption, control extreme temperatures. We recently had all these extremes both in summer and in winter. We need to work on that, protect urban wildlife, and promote physical and mental health. And that is important for our well-being. So definitely there is that link between improving what is there for the environment, but also how much that can be improved for us as humans. And then the question was, okay, we want to improve and to increase the amount of ecosystem services, but where to produce those if we think about a city? So we start looking into, okay, it could be the front yards, could be the backyards, could be parks, could be community gardens, could be sidewalks and boulevards. Knowing that these three, the last ones, are going to be related with the municipality, with the city plans. So probably as individuals, we not necessarily can contribute totally on those. We can take care of the parks, we can work in the community gardens, but it's going to depend a lot on the city. However, as individual contribution, we can work our front yards, which you know that are one of the biggest according to our research. Also the backyards, but that depends a lot on how we use the backyard, and that is a little more complicated to understand or to see from outside. So definitely we thought, okay, front yards is where we can start working on, knowing that there is a whole space there, and currently a monoculture. So there is a huge space, definitely a good opportunity to start working and to start producing more ecosystem services.
So what we did in our research project, two of the components were a couple of experimental surveys. One for homeowners, and the second one we ran it with university students. But the one with homeowners, one of the questions we were interested in is the uses of front yards by these homeowners. So we asked them how often they use the front yard, And you can see this diagram, this graph here showing the frequency of use of front yards. And even if half of the respondents, more or less, answered that they use it either always or very often, and then we have the other half saying sometimes, rarely, or not at all. But what is interesting is the specific uses that homeowners give to these spaces. So the second diagram on these slides shows the responses when homeowners were asked to explain the uses of the front yard. So the majority of respondents said that they use the front yards to maintain a lawn, of course, as something that we can visually see across the city, and also for gardening. And then minor uses included socializing with neighbors, playing, and storage. So we have two important elements that have to do with social health, which is socializing with neighbors. But what is interesting is that that is not specific to the lawns. We can also have that type of activities with native pollinator gardens. So it's interesting to see how homeowners use their front yards. And as Anna was saying, we have a very large space that is precisely that corresponds to front yards. And in the US, for example, the lawn is the largest monocrop in the country, and something similar may be happening in Canada. And that brings, of course, some disadvantages when we have monocrops. That will bring some environmental challenges for native species, for pollinators as well.
And when we think about the lawn culture, it's like when we started having this, because one of the challenges is change that urban landscape, but we have to go back in time. So everything started with this social organization of the Victorian times. At the beginning, few people really can actually have this space for recreation as another amenity. Most of the time when people have some space, because of the times, it was for producing food, for the self-producing food. But the moment that there was access to more land and resources, people start changing and they start kind of demonstrating this higher social status by having the loan. Unfortunately, this, how it started, just keep on going in most neighborhoods in North America. We can see that there is a lot of of loan, but not necessarily knowing why we're having this and what it really seems to be. There are many articles. There have been a lot of discussion about this related to how much we are taking some culture that not necessarily is related to each of the places that we have. And unfortunately, is a lot that is related to this. So changing that is one of the huge things, one of the huge challenges, how much we are ready to see a different urban landscape and how much we really want to adopt a different garden in our places.
So knowing that there is this lawn culture, especially in suburban neighborhoods, we ask homeowners again how likely they are to adopt native pollinator gardens. And this happened after providing all the information about the advantages and disadvantages of lawns, and also the advantages and disadvantages of native pollinator gardens. So you can see on this diagram that almost 2/3 of the respondents, 2/3 of homeowners, said that they are either extremely likely or very likely to adopt native pollinator gardens. We have a smaller shares of homeowners, of the homeowner sample in our study, saying that they are either moderately likely, somewhat likely, or not at all likely. So what this diagram shows is that there is the intention, homeowners' intention to transform their lawns into native pollinator gardens. But of course, the path from intention to action can be very, very long. So part of our research in the second stage of this project is going deeper into these motivations of homeowners. We asked a similar question. We asked homeowners a similar question. And this second question was about what they think about their neighbors and how likely they thought their neighbors were to adopt a native pollinator garden. And the results were very similar to what you find on this diagram. almost 2/3 of the respondents said that their neighbors were either extremely likely or very likely to adopt native pollinator gardens. So it's not only the homeowner intention, but also the perception that their neighbors will do the same.
And when we were looking into the adoption of pollinator gardens and other benefits about this, or what can be addressed with this, one of the big things is that, according to Cirillo, we are experiencing biodiversity and climate crisis. There are many species around the world, wild species, including pollinators, that are declining, and that is it is something that goes against what we are supposed to be doing with the environment. According to Zimmerman, a professor in Toronto, also says that gardening native species lowers the amount of the water needed. There is many research showing this. And also there are other benefits, which is reduced weeding. That is interesting to see how much people that love to have the lawn are going to spend a lot of the time trying to take all the weeds away, not knowing exactly sometimes why we don't want the weeds, but probably it is a native plant, probably it's not, but it is a lot of time and amount of effort and budget going into using pesticides, weeding, and the maintenance of the lawn. And of course, all of that also can increase damages to the soil and damages to the environment. So it is really interesting that adoption of the pollinator gardens have really other benefits in general, and that also can go directly to human health.
So another important dimension of our analysis was the motivation, homeowners' motivation to make the switch from lawns to native pollinator gardens. And we explored this dimension of analysis by asking them where they agreed that making the switch and producing ecosystem services in their properties was a social obligation or a moral obligation. And again, you can see in these diagrams that a large percent of respondents agreed with both, actually. They believe this will be a social, but also a moral obligation. And this can have very important implications from a policy perspective, because one possibility or one alternative or one policy instrument will be to appeal to the social obligation or the moral obligation of homeowners and asking them or inviting them to make the switch to more alternative and sustainable gardening practices. So only few people, only few homeowners didn't agree with these two statements, that the production of ecosystem services were both social and moral, and a moral obligation.
Then we also have another question that we asked was, how willing are people to pay for ecosystem services benefits? So one is, okay, I want to have, and probably I want to adopt a pollinator garden, but actually how willing I am to pay for those benefits. If I understand the whole thing about the benefits, if I understand all what that comes around. So that is another part of our experimental survey. But to understand that, we also needed to understand who lives in suburban and try to understand what it means, what are the benefits, or what are the different things that we have in suburban areas. So we did this study for Saskatoon and Calgary. Here I'm going to show only what we have in Saskatoon. So we have some neighborhoods that we did our research on. So we see that, for example, in terms of vulnerable populations, we have seniors, for example. There is a good amount of people, of seniors, living in these areas. Also, if we look into our youth, kids under 14 years old also are have a good number of them living in the suburban. So there is other reasons as well, considering these demographics. But we look into what are the environmental features of these places. We see, for example, that this is the greenness index, and we see that when there is more green, it's mostly around the inner city, not downtown that you see that is really white, but in suburban areas, we have a lot of whites as well. It should be all green, all dark green, but unfortunately it's not. So there is a lack of all these of this greenness that we know there are many benefits if you have that. And if we look into this other one, which is alarming, is the land surface temperature, which is related to the heat island effect. And you see that, especially in those places, exactly the same places, same as downtown that was all white before with the greening, but also the suburbia, we see a lot of this red. And that means that it is a much higher land surface temperature than in other areas that are covered by trees or covered by biodiversity, by vegetation. So there is another reason why we need to increase the amount of greenery, especially if it is native species in these areas, because we want really to reduce this. Another thing that we were counting on is the particular mother in Saskatoon. However, this is not only linked to the amount of greenery, it's also linked with wind and where in the city are located. So you see that most of the places that have more particular mother are unfortunately related to the industrial district, that is all this area that also was totally without the greenery, but also in some places of suburbia. Depends on the winds, that is also something that's going to change, but we know that based on evidence that also we can reduce this particular matter if we add more greenery. So considering all of this information that we have from the special analysis, but also from ecosystem services, and with that information and knowing that we can put that together and ask people if they are willing to pay, is that we conduct this other experiment.
So for the second experiment, what we did is we invite university students to be part of this study. And the purpose of the study was to identify and to determine whether information about the benefits of native pollinator gardens and their associated ecosystem services influenced the participants' willingness to pay. So the way we did this was basically inviting students to take our online survey, experimental survey, and we gave them $10. And from these $10, they had to make a decision. And the decision was to determine from these $10 how much they wanted to contribute to make a donation to organizations doing this type of work, supporting the adoption of native pollinator gardens. So our hypothesis was basically that with information, people will increase their willingness to pay. If they know more about the ecosystem services that are produced or that can be produced by native pollinator gardens, all the benefits associated with these ecosystem services, it can be environmental benefits, economic benefits, social and health benefits as well. So we wanted to determine if different levels of information would affect participants' willingness to pay. And basically what they had to do was to, so they were assigned to different treatment groups. And on this slide, you can see the different treatments. So we have one control, which is, you can read this slide vertically. So on the extreme left, you have three images. And we have these three images showing the before and after, before with a lawn and after with a native pollinator garden. So we use photo montages to describe how these front yards would look like if they would adopt a native pollinator garden. So in the control group, what we had is basically this visual stimuli for participants. So they didn't receive any information about the benefits of ecosystem services and the benefits of native pollinator gardens. They only had this visual effect. So that was our control group. So then we said, okay, we can start increasing the level of information and see how participants' willingness to pay changes over these different treatments. So treatment one, which is the second column, the second from the left, participants in this treatment, they receive economic information about the cost of implementing and maintaining lawns and native pollinator gardens. And what our research found was that native pollinator gardens are actually cheaper than lawns in both aspects, for upfront costs and also for maintenance costs. So we provide this information to our participants in our second group or in our treatment one. So that was the economic information for participants. In the second treatment, treatment 2, the third group of participants, they saw the same images, the same visual, visual images as in the case of group 1 and group 2, control and treatment 1. And also, they have the information about the economic benefits of having native pollinator gardens. But on top of that, they receive another piece of information, a new piece of information that related to the environmental benefits of ecosystem services, or the environmental benefits of native pollinator gardens. So they had this additional piece of information. And finally, our treatment 3, our fourth group, the one that you can see on the extreme right. So they received the same visual images, information about the economic benefits of native pollinator gardens, the environmental benefits of native pollinator gardens. But on top of that, they receive also information about social and health benefits of native pollinator gardens. So what we did at the end, as you can see, is having this incremental treatment in terms of information. Again, interested in finding if different levels of information can lead to different, or can produce different willingness to pay among participants in our study. So this is the number of participants in each of the groups. So it's very balanced, maybe with the exception of treatment 2, that only has 25 participants. But the other groups are very balanced in terms of number of participants. The next slide, this slide, what this slide shows is the average willingness to pay. So we are measuring willingness to pay as this amount that participants decided to donate to this organization supporting the cause, supporting the implementation of native pollinator gardens. And the results are very interesting, as you can see here. So again, we have the average willingness to pay for each of the groups, from control to the different treatments from left to right. And interestingly enough, the highest willingness to pay, or the highest average willingness to pay, was reported among participants in the first group, in the control group, those that only received the visual stimuli. The other groups have a similar average willingness to pay, but slightly lower. But in any case, the average willingness to pay is around 50% of the endowment that we gave to our participants. So more or less, from the $10 that we give to participants, they decided to donate, on average, half of that endowment. So what we are not seeing here is what we were hypothesizing before. So we are not seeing that providing these incremental levels of information actually influences participants' willingness to pay. And so we were a little bit curious about this result, because again, this goes against our hypothesis. But we also asked our participants in this study what they liked the most about the images that they saw, the images and the contrast between lawns and native pollinator gardens. And what most of the respondents said was basically all these visual elements that are very attractive in native pollinator gardens. For example, flowers, the colors, the shapes of the plants, all these visual elements that make native pollinator gardens more attractive than the lawn. So at this point, what we believe is that this visual effect dominated the other information treatments. But in our next stage, what we're going to do is to separate these levels of information to see if there is a specific information that is more effective to increase willingness to pay. So from a policy perspective, this is valuable information, or this can be valuable information, because if the city, for example, is interested in promoting this type of gardening practices, they could appeal, or they could implement information campaigns focusing on specific aspects of benefits of native pollinator gardens. So analyzing the data a little bit more, we realized that willingness to pay among our participants, willingness to pay depended a lot on two elements. Previous knowledge of participants, previous knowledge of ecosystem services and the benefits associated with them, and also their interest in learning more about native pollinator gardens. And of course, the student population is a segment of the population in the city, and probably in their courses at the university, they have worked on projects associated with sustainability, ecosystems, native plants, and so on. So probably that previous knowledge influenced their responses, their donations. And that's why we don't see differences across treatments. Also, for homeowners, and this is for homeowners, we ask them for their preferences over different policy instruments. If in case the municipality, the city, would be interested in promoting native pollinator gardens across the city. So they have different alternatives, but you can see here that most homeowners would prefer to have incentives provided by the city. Incentives to those homeowners that are interested in making the switch from lawns to native pollinator gardens. The support for other type of instruments, such as charging a fee for no adoption, is much less, as you can see here. Only 8% of the respondents agree with that. Implementing a bylaw to make native pollinator gardens mandatory also had little support, only 5% of the respondents. And finally, people preferring the city to do nothing about it is also a very small percentage. It's only 1%. So again, from a policy perspective, this is very important because that provides information to policymakers, specifically about the preferences, in this case, homeowners' preferences. But when we asked a similar question to our student population, they basically responded in a similar way.
So as conclusions, and also taking all the information so far and knowing that it's an ongoing research and there are so much more to be done, we have there is one that is a growing interest and great potential to create pollinator corridors in urban areas. And we mentioned corridors because it's not only good that we have only one garden and one pollinator garden. It's important to create a corridor so the pollinators can go from one place to another and always find these spots that they can feel safe from predators and that can keep on going with what we need in terms of the cities. So it's important to create this corridor. The benefits of greenery in the cities include controlled surface temperature that we saw that actually in Saskatoon, we do have a lot of problem in that, especially because of the proportion between the roads, the sidewalks, and the gardens, and also reduce the particulate matter that is part of the ecosystem services. We also can increase creating more climate resilient cities that are needed, especially for our well-being, for the residents' well-being. And that is one of the huge things that we found that is important definitely in the cities. With all the things that are happening, with all the climate change, it is important to start creating these resilient cities. The other is that the production of ecosystem services is fundamental to adapting cities to, well, especially Canadian Prairies, to climate change, especially in scenarios of water scarcity, heat waves, and health impacts. We constantly are listening to all the problems that we can have in terms of health impacts. And that is one of the big things. If we can create this corridor and that if we can create more of these pollinator gardens, we are also providing with these services, not for one group or one specific group, but ideally for the whole population. We can start in the suburbia spaces because of the spaces that we have, and also because we think that if there are so much things, or there's so much discussion about what suburbia is providing to the city. Probably this is something that suburbia can provide to the city, and that can benefit everyone, and that is kind of create this equity in receiving the ecosystem benefits. And there are opportunities for municipalities to get involved. There are a lot of willingness in terms of people of having and adopting, but it's a lot of how to promote, how I can start, and especially the upfront costs. So there is an opportunity for municipalities to start adopting and start working with these native pollinator gardens. Yeah, and that's all our presentation. We are going to start answering your questions, but if you have any other questions or comments, you feel free to send us an email or to visit our website. We have some information as well there. Hopefully we keep updating that, but that is some information of the research that we have been working on. Thank you, everyone.
As Anna was saying, this is an ongoing research project. So we will have other surveys and work with organizations and residents. So if you are interested in knowing more about it, just send us an email.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for the great presentation. We already have lots of questions. And one of them is regarding being able to access your slides. If somebody wanted to see your slides afterwards, like we record the webinar and we'll have it on our YouTube channel in the near future. But could they contact you to get a copy of your slides?
Yeah, absolutely. Or probably also, if it is possible, also we can send to you. So in case someone directly asks you, but yeah, we can, you just write our email and then we can send the slides back.
Okay, perfect. And then we have a couple questions regarding kind of the methods and the research that you were talking about earlier in the presentation. And the first one is about which city or cities were the homeowners surveyed? Was it all in Saskatoon?
Yeah, so the project is on Prairie cities, and we chose Calgary and Saskatoon. So the homeowners that were part of this survey are homeowners in Calgary and Saskatoon, both cities.
Okay. And then there's another question about regarding the Saskatoon Metro map. Can you explain why there's an intense grouping for the plot of particulate matter in the Saskatoon Metro map?
Well, one of the understanding of that is related to the wind. Unfortunately, wind is going to take, sometimes even in some industrial areas, you're going to see that there's not a lot of particulate matter because a lot of that takes to the next neighborhood. And that's why one of the reasons that we need more vegetation in those areas. But the other, unfortunately, is also related to where exactly are all the industrial areas, for example, but also is the lack of protection. In some places, what we're seeing is that if you create some of these barriers with vegetation, that can reduce some of this particulate matter. And of course, that is kind of an average, so not necessarily is that every single day or all the times like that. But yeah, it is related to the wind as well. And it's related where in the city are located all the industrial areas that are going to take all of that, that are one of the biggest ones that take all this particulate matter.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We've had quite a few questions come in about sources for native plants. And somebody's commented that the Saskatchewan Native Plant Society, npss.sk.ca, has a great list. Do either of you have any recommendations?
Well, there are good, definitely. We know that also Wild About Saskatoon have some sources around. We are trying to complete a catalog with some sources as well where are going to those native plants are, but yeah, our catalog is still being completed, but yeah, there are those sources. I think those are probably the best because they not only have the sources where to find, but also they have where to buy or how to find some of the seeds or how to share, because sometimes it's hard to find the seeds. You don't go and buy because they are native. So it is important to understand that, because some of those are necessarily coming from here. So yeah, I think those are the good sources, definitely.
So we have a few questions about just kind of attitudes. So the first one from someone named William, have you challenged the homeowners understanding the upfront maintenance needed to keep out weeds on a native landscape compared to just turf that they can cut with a mower?
Yeah, so the purpose of this research project is to identify the opportunities and challenges. So we have described many of the opportunities in terms of benefits, and it's not only environmental benefits, but also economic and social benefits. And so with respect to the economic benefits, so there are economic benefits if homeowners adopt native pollinator gardens in terms of costs, maintenance costs, basically, which will include the dealing with with weeds and all that. But of course, there is a learning component, and that's something that we're also interested in understanding, because even if we have all these benefits, and these are clear benefits supported by different research and in different places as well. But of course, studying this change in gardening practices can be very difficult because there is a learning curve, for sure. So having to change gardening practices, having to learn more about these native plants, and also the elements associated with these micro ecosystems that start being created in our gardens, and how is the best way to maintain this. So there will be some learning curve, and that will be part of the challenges that homeowners will face the moment that they decide to make this switch. But at some point in our project, we visited some homeowners with native pollinator gardens. And of course, these are homeowners that were very much interested and very much into native plants to start with, and that is a very important motivation. But learning from them and listening to them, they didn't mention that as one of the challenges or one of the problems with native pollinator gardens. I think that is a most prevalent problem with lawns, much more than with native pollinator, native plants. But that's something that a good point, and because it can be not only the facts of making the switch of these practices, but perceptions are very important. So that's something that we need to understand better, homeowners' perceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to mention that PCAP has a YouTube channel, which has some great resources from past webinars that we've done. Gail Fennell, the Edmonton Native Plant Society have presented about how to actually plant native plants. Like you mentioned, there's a learning curve there, so I'll just mention that for anyone who's interested. And our next question is actually kind of about perspective. What are your thoughts about people and a willingness to be patient regarding transforming their lawn? Have you had any pushback or any thoughts about that?
That's a very interesting question, because we were like, okay, let's start working in the lawn. And of course, it is like the patience, because at some point you have the lawn, and probably it's kind of, we already learned how to take care of it. But what happens with the other plants, how much I have to wait. The beauty of it is that native plants, the pollinators, they just keep on going, they do the work. If they are native, they are going to feel like, oh, this is home. So but you have to be patient, definitely, because knowing that the season is not going to be like, it's not an ongoing season that you can have from January to December. So you have to wait the next season. But it is interesting to see that some of the gardens that actually change and make the change to native pollinator gardens is 1 to 2nd season is already like blossoming. So it is really beautiful to see that you have to wait a year, probably 2, until you have something, but it's not a lot of time as sometimes we could see. In some of the gardens, as Oscar was mentioning, that we visited, they were already like beautiful native forest with all the prairie there. So it is something that it is not a lot of time that, for example, if you have to wait for certain trees, it is much less time, and you can have already and start enjoying the garden. And of course, the maintenance is not all the time that now what's happening. It's like probably at the beginning, but yeah, definitely for the good things, patience is always important.
Yeah. Have you done any research or have any thoughts about potentially the increase of rodents or rodent diversity with the increase of native gardens?
Well, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that we haven't. So that is an interesting point, something that we can consider in our research project. So thank you for that.
But one of the things that we have also to know is that it's not it's quite the same. Let's say, like it depends whether the plants you have, if it is native or not. There are animals that are going to be around, but one of the things that we know is that it's going to be a more balanced biodiversity. Because one of the problems that we have when we have roses, for example, is because we have certain areas or that kind of a separation between it's like, for example, when we have the wasps, they don't have enough space, enough pollinators, so they have to just go to one specific side. But if we have more about that, they just do the work and don't need any extra sugar or anything else, because they will have more space and more pollinators to do the work. So it is important if we start creating more of these spaces, so there are going to be more animals and yes, more wildlife. But the thing is, wildlife is going to be doing the work while we do ours. The thing is that right now wildlife is hard to see. You see that in some places, like, for example, in Vancouver, sometimes you see much more, but even if they don't have a corridor to go through, they do have more space or kind of feel a little more safe going around the urban spaces. Unfortunately, we have really few in here in Saskatoon, like one coyote, two coyotes, but because we don't have all the corridor to allow them to keep on going and just do the work. So yeah, part of this is probably also how to or learn to live with wildlife, not only in terms of vegetation, but also in terms of other animals, in terms of pollinators that they need to do their work, just like each one of their work.
And that's an excellent point, because we all love bees and ladybugs, but not all of us like wasps. But wasps are very important pollinators in our ecosystems. So that is, for example, one of the elements that will be also another challenge. If the homeowners or people in general don't like wasps, and so how we address that? But again, a healthy ecosystem is an ecosystem with many insects, many animals, plants as well. So that's healthy. And as Anna was saying, we have to get used to live with wildlife, especially in the context of climate change, for all the reasons that we have been discussing this afternoon. And something that's gonna happen on the prairies, water scarcity. We haven't mentioned water, the difference in terms of water consumption to keep a lawn beautifully green and to maintain a healthy native pollinator garden. But that's another dimension and a huge environmental cost of lawns.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a few questions about kind of bylaws at the municipal level. Do you know of any initiatives within Saskatoon or other municipalities in Saskatchewan to actually have incentives for native yard plantings or to make native plantings more prominent in public green spaces?
Unfortunately, not like a bylaw as I know. Well, I don't know everything about that, but one of the things that it is kind of suggested by the city of Saskatoon is having this cityscaping. So it's giving another option to people to start with when they have their houses. Not exactly necessarily as incentive, but I may be wrong. But yeah, that is exactly what we want to work on, to start looking into that, because we know that there are other cities that actually have incentives and actually pay homeowners to have their pollinator gardens. And we really would love to see that happening in Saskatchewan, because not only because the payment itself, but because that means that more people are going to say, okay, okay, so I don't go with the loan because probably that's the only thing I know, but also there are other options that I can start growing until everything is working. So that could be really great. But yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I will be mistaken of a specific incentive to start with the pollinator gardens.
Something that the city of Saskatoon is doing is replacing the loan in parks and other public areas and introducing native plants. And the reason for that is that native plants don't need the amount of water that the loan needs. So it's a water-saving technology. Native plants are water-saving technologies, and that's very important in the context of climate change.
Absolutely. And an attendee named Sherry has mentioned that in Edmonton, there's a new boulevard gardening permit, which allows people to dig up their boulevards and to plant smaller shrubs, but not trees. And you have to buy a permit with the city. And I guess it was a pilot project. And it was Edmonton's 2023 Boulevard Gardening Program. And so since the launch of this program, they received over 200 applications. So that's pretty
Wonderful.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sherry, for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then she's got a link there too, if anyone's interested. It looks like edmonton.ca, Boulevard Gardening. And yeah, so that's really, really interesting.
And it is a learning process, because one of the things that we learn in this process is, for example, they started in the UK this idea of, okay, let's allow the meadows to come back. And people at the beginning were like, no, meadows, like, no, because that is not like very like super cities stuff. But little by little, they just start the project, and then they start having all that. And the moment they were blossoming, people were really happy. And even they start reducing the speed limit. So there's a lot of benefits around that. And now people are not complaining anymore of having all these native plants going back to certain highways and to certain drives within the cities there. So there are opportunities, definitely. They are going to be liked, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. And Ingrid has asked, what was the size or number of people in your survey?
So in our two surveys, so for with the students we have 180, for homeowners 240.
Okay, so quite a few then. That's great. And I just want to mention there's been a few comments about other resources. Susan has written in that wildaboutsaskatoon.org is a great resource for going native. And Ingrid has written in that a blue grandma lawn is posted on the Native Plant Society website and has a link there. It's cut once a year, uses no fertilizer, and can include pollinator plants. So that's quite interesting too. And then Kyla has mentioned to check out the City of Saskatoon Naturalization and Water Conservation, and has the link there as well. And William has written in to say, FYI, the state of Minnesota is giving $500 per yard now. I think that's a pretty good incentive.
Yes, yeah,
Exactly.
that's one of the ones that we learned, and it was like, oh, wow. And we learned during this project, because at the beginning it was like a lot of spaces, like void spaces, not knowing, okay, what we are going to do. But little by little, we start learning from different people, knowing a lot of people interested in the project, but also learning many things. One of was like a lot of community gardens around different cities in the world, like including even cities like Detroit, that they had a lot of problems, and then start with the food security and start working that kind of stuff. So we start learning a lot about this, and it is like a lot of interest. And actually start with native pollinator gardens, start with native plants that also can be food, and now with food security, and that also related to water, etc. So there's a lot of potential. It's just a matter of start working on that and start kind of having this domino effect that one can start, and then the rest just keep on going with what is needed.
And thank you, William, for sharing that. So part of the work that we have started doing is to collect all these different policies in different countries, in different places that are promoting the switch from lawns to native gardens. So that because we are seeing that more and more cities are doing this, and we believe that will be hopefully convincing enough for our own city authorities to do something similar, or at least to be more active, not necessarily paying homeowners, that can be costly, but implementing some type of incentives for homeowners.
Absolutely. And then our next question might be out of the scope of your research, but Michael's wondering if you've considered asking homeowners if they might be interested in using green roofs as a way to use that wasted space to increase native plants and pollinator gardens.
We haven't thought about that, but it's a
That's
good idea.
an excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely, because there are so many spaces, and we know that in Vancouver, for example, the next building that you want to have a permit, you need to have a green roof. And of course, probably that is something that cities that are still this size probably we have to start before it's too late, and then we have to push to people to do that. So yeah, I think it's really a great suggestion. Thank you for that.
And
Yes.
we started the project with something in mind that was basically doing something to make these suburban neighborhoods a natural asset to the city. And each of us in our own homes, in our own places, can become a natural asset to the city and a provider of different ecosystem services. So there are different spaces in the city, different spaces in our own homes as well, that can contribute to not only to sustainability, but also to climate change adaptation. At the end, native plants will have a very important role to play in helping us to adapt to all the consequences of climate change, basically rising temperatures and also water scarcity.
Absolutely. And then Trisha's written in about the City of Calgary Yard Smart webpage. So I guess that's a good resource there, and the link is in there as well. And then, oh, and you have a webinar happening, another one this week. Is that correct? On Thursday?
Yes, we do.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you'll be talking about there?
Oh, I was like, we are going to be talking a little about our research. We are going to be also be focusing on what are the details, the things that people look that they like the most related to the of native pollinator gardens. So we're focusing most in that part that's more related to the services of the ecosystem services, but put into a what people would like to see. And also we are going to have another guest that is the one knowing how to. So a lot of questions of how you are going to be doing that, how to start having the native pollinator gardens, how to start that. That is something that's going to be answered by another specialist on this area.
And from our part, we are also going to talk a little bit more about how homeowners see the different attributes of native pollinator gardens, which is another component of our survey with homeowners. So they had the opportunity to make simple selections across different scenarios based on attributes of native pollinator gardens. And we are hoping to, with that, we are hoping to identify some of the how they see the challenges as well and the opportunities of making the switch.
Awesome. And if people are interested in catching that webinar, how can they register for it?
I think they have to go to the page of Wild About Saskatoon. I think there is one link for conversations. So I don't have it around here, but yeah, if they go to Wild About Saskatoon, there's going to be a link for conversations, and then it's going to be our presentation for Thursday.
Okay, perfect. Sounds like Wildwood Saskatoon is a really, really great resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think that's
there
all
is a link. I think Joanne put the link there. So thank you, Joanne. So they can go.
Okay, perfect. Oh, yes. Starting a native plant garden. Awesome. And Michael Skinner will be the expert with you there. And he's spoken at PCAP events in the past and has won an award for his how to teach how to grow native plants, because it's not that simple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. So I just want to thank you both so much for the really fascinating presentation. And it's great that you're doing this research and sharing it with us. And we really appreciate you taking the time to, well, first of all, for the research that you're doing, but then to explain it to us and in such a fabulous presentation. It was so interesting and informative. So thank you both.
No,
Thank you for
thank you
inviting
for
us,
having
Katie.
us. Yeah,
And
we
thank you
really enjoy
everyone.
it.
Thank you everyone for attending this webinar.
Thanks everyone for catching today's first webinar of Prairie's Got the Goods Week. We have 4 more coming up this week. So if you want to see what's going on, check out the PCAP website. And we have a schedule of events there, as well as links for the other webinars. When you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. I read through them and I appreciate all the feedback that we get, so we can find speakers for the future too, and report back to our funders as well. So we really appreciate if you can fill that out. So with that, thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.